Hey, Dustin Conrad with BantamBody.com, multi-limb resistance training. So welcome to another episode of Symptoms, Sources, and Solutions. And today we're talking about the anterior pelvic tilt, or AKA the duck walker. Gonna start off by first telling you the solution, since I know that's why you're here. And to do that, let me first start off by telling you a brief story about my personal experience with ATP. So once upon a time, long, long ago, in a far-off land called Calabasas, I was a wee little duckling, chasing girls around the playground and my friends, and leading with my chest, and causing my lower back to arch and my butt to stick out, in order to keep my center of gravity aligned. So doing that over years and years left me with this ingrained movement pattern and postural deficiency. So flash forward 20 years later, I become a personal trainer and start exploring all the biomechanics of the human body and finding that my very own biomechanics were somewhat faulty in some ways. In particular, these pronounced protruding of my ass with the anterior pelvic tilting forward in front. So I read and I applied and I strengthened and stretched, and to no avail, I strengthened my already strong glutes, hamstrings, and core, and thinking that was the problem, and nothing was solved. And I stretched my seemingly told tight hip flexors and quadriceps and lower back, and that didn't seem to solve the problem either. So nothing really changed until I started exploring this neuromuscular control over my pelvic tilting backward and forward. Or the mind-muscle relationship, my mind telling my pelvis, my nerves to tilt my pelvis back and forward. And that's when things started to change. So what I did was I started from a supported position, arching and rounding my back from the table, so hands right below the shoulders and knees below the hips. So least amount of gravitational effect on the pelvis, most control. Then I progressed to an isolated version of that, lying supine or on my back, thrusting my hips up and pressing my lower back into the ground, learning to establish that movement pattern. Then I finally graduated to standing vertical and pushing and pulling in my pelvis, now with the effects of gravity influencing. So that would be the tier of those three, the top tier of those three. Then, by doing that is where I hit the jackpot with this next technique, which I aptly named the slot machine. So this is where you are squeezing your butt cheeks together as if, and you pretending that you have a quarter in between them, and to drop it means that you're going to lose $1 million. So you're squeezing those butt cheeks together as if your life depends on it. Side note, do not do this if you have hemorrhoids. I'm just kidding. I don't know from personal experience on that one, actually. And what I noticed was that by doing that, it forced my pelvis into a neutral position. So then, by constantly reminding myself that $1 million was on the line, and I had to constantly keep those glutes engaged by squeezing the butt cheeks together, my butt has awoken. And now I feel that I have established control over my pelvis by waking up the glute muscles, which had been dormant by either the movement pattern or some sort of deficiency or imbalance. Then I noticed that for others who by contracting the glutes caused their pelvis to rotate into a neutral position, seemed to fix the problem, then that was their solution, the constantly reminding and creating this new neural pathway of awakening the glutes. So if that doesn't work for you, then the third solution would be to resort to the stretching and strengthening techniques. And we'll get into that a little bit. But first we'll talk about the mechanics of an anterior pelvic tilt. So if the pelvis is tilting anteriorly, meaning it's dipping forward in front, then what's happening is you have a tight lower back. The lower back is going to be engaged, probably arched. And then you have tight hip flexors, probably from sitting, and quadriceps, which are pulling it down in front. Conversely, you also have stretched out hamstrings and glutes, which would serve to pull it down from the back. So they're being pulled upwards, stretching them out. And then often the core strength isn't sufficient enough to pull it up slightly. So attacking those areas with a stretching, strengthening, and stimulating program would be the protocol for that. So let's recap those 3 solutions that we've talked about so far. We had hip mobility, glute activation, and the stretching and strengthening techniques. So hip mobility we defined as the neuromuscular control over your ability and control to tilt the pelvis back and forward, up or down. Glute activation we described as the waking up of a dormant muscle by way of physically contracting it. And then thirdly, the stretching and strengthening techniques, which we just went over as antagonist-agonist imbalances. So now we'll go ahead and talk about the causes and conditions of the anterior pelvic tilting, or the bandsandbodies.com's symptoms, sources, and solutions. So let's talk about the symptoms and the 3 P's of the symptoms, which are pain, pooling, and peculiarities. So pain, you may notice that the client or you have lower back pain or hip flexor pain from the hip flexors constantly in that contracted state if you're sitting for long periods, or when you're standing with that anterior pelvic tilt from behind, lower back is contracted. Pulling, you may notice that the stomach is pulling or protruding forward, and the butt is pulling or pushing upward from behind. And peculiarities, you may notice that the hip mobility, the dominion over the hip mobility is lacking on you or your client. So sources, we'll talk about the 3 I's of sources: inactive, inefficient, or inflexible. So inactive, you may find that the glutes or the hip flexors are not as active as they should be, either from overusage of the hip flexors or underusage of the glutes. Inefficient, you may find that the glutes, hamstrings, and core are not sufficient enough to pull the pelvis into place. The hamstrings and glutes are not pulling it down from the back, and the core is not stabilizing or slightly pulling it up from the front. And inflexible, you may find that the quads, hip flexors, and lower back are not flexible enough to release the tension that's pulling the pelvis up from behind on the lower back being contracted, or down in front on the quads and hip flexors being contracting, pulling it down. And that can be due to bad habits or postural deficiencies while sitting or standing. And 3 solutions, which are defined as the 3 S's: stimulating, stretching, and strengthening. So stimulate the glutes to wake up, or the hip flexors to relax. And then once you've activated or deactivated those muscles, you can then stretch them. And you would stretch the hip flexors, quadriceps, to release their pull from the front, and then the lower back to release the pull from upward from behind. And then you would want to strengthen to hold those muscles in place and the pelvis in place. And you would strengthen the glutes and the hamstrings to pull the pelvis down from the back, and then the core to stabilize and kind of pull up on the front. So those are the symptoms, sources, and solutions for the anterior pelvic tilt. Thanks for tuning in. Definitely subscribe to my YouTube page, and also check out my other videos to learn more about healing, treating, correcting ailments or postural deficiencies and movement patterns. And if you're in the LA area, check out a session. And if you're outside of the LA area, check out a virtual session. And remember, $1 million.